No one at Camp Florence ever expected a love story. It was a place built for silence, suspicion, and survival. A desert fortress where the U.S. military stored the last thing it wanted to deal with, captured German soldiers. But what happened inside those fences would become one of the most forbidden romances in American wartime history. The year was 1944. The world was bleeding. Entire nations were burning. And yet, in the middle of an Arizona desert, something unfolded that neither Hitler nor the U.S. Army could have predicted. That story begins with a young African-American nurse named Eleanor Powell, stepping off a transport truck with her duffel bag, her uniform pressed, and her eyes fixed straight ahead. She had trained to save American soldiers. Instead, the Army sent her to care for men who wore swastikas on their sleeves. The irony was suffocating. Eleanor lived in a country that still treated her as a second-class citizen. Segregated buses, segregated hospitals, segregated cafeterias. Yet her orders were clear: tend to the medical needs of enemy prisoners, many of whom had been raised on Nazi propaganda, telling them that people like her were inferior. As she walked through the dusty pathways of Camp Florence for the first time, hundreds of German POWs watched her silently. Some stared out of shock, some out of confusion, others because they had simply never seen a Black American woman in authority before. But among those eyes was one pair she did not expect to notice. Frederick Albert, a German POW assigned as a camp cook, looked at her not with contempt, but with curiosity, respect, even a flicker of admiration. Eleanor felt it instantly, but buried it somewhere deep. In a place ruled by barbed wire, American military law, and racial segregation, even the slightest spark of connection was a dangerous thing. But destiny has a habit of slipping through cracks no fence can block.
Their paths should never have crossed. A POW cook and a U.S. Army nurse were not supposed to exchange anything beyond instructions and medical charts. Yet, every day the desert pulled them closer. Frederick found reasons, innocent ones at first, to deliver supplies to the medical ward. A box of vegetables, a crate of flour, extra water during the hottest days. He always approached with a strange gentleness, the kind that seemed out of place inside a prison camp. And Eleanor, despite every warning echoing in her mind, noticed. She noticed the careful way he spoke, as if he didn't want to trigger the hostility others carried. She noticed the way he stepped aside to give her space, something many American officers refused to do. She noticed that he looked at her not as an enemy, and not as a woman defined by a racist society, but simply as a human being. Their conversations were small at first. "Hot today," he would say. "Always hot," she would answer. But those small exchanges became small risks, and small risks became bigger ones. Frederick began to confide small truths about his life in Germany, not the Nazi ideology, but his real life, his mother's cooking, the river he swam in as a boy, the brother he lost on the Eastern Front. And Eleanor shared pieces of her world, the cold winters of Massachusetts, her dream of becoming a nurse since childhood, and the exhaustion of serving a country that wouldn't even let her sit in certain restaurants. Slowly, the walls around them, barbed wire, military rules, and years of propaganda began to crack. What neither of them said out loud, but both felt, was this: the enemy they had been taught to fear did not stand in front of them. Instead, two lonely souls had found each other in the unlikeliest place on earth.
But every growing emotion inside Camp Florence carried a shadow. The closer Eleanor and Frederick grew, the more dangerous their connection became. Military police patrolled constantly, scanning for any sign of improper communication between guards, nurses, and prisoners. Even a lingering glance could become evidence of misconduct. For Eleanor, the risks were heavier than for anyone else. She wasn't just a woman in uniform. She was a Black woman in a segregated army. One accusation could destroy her career,
stain her record forever, or worse, put her in physical danger. And Frederick, as a prisoner, had even more to lose. A simple suspicion could land him in solitary confinement or have him transferred to a harsher camp. Yet, despite the danger, something in the silence between them kept pulling them back toward each other. It wasn't dramatic, like in movies. It was slower, organic. A connection born out of loneliness, respect, and the strange comfort two outsiders found in each other. There were moments when Eleanor tried to break the invisible thread tying them together. She would avoid the kitchen path where he worked. She would force herself to walk faster when he approached. She would answer with professional coldness. But every time she did, something about his quiet, almost wounded expression made her chest tighten. Because deep down, she knew the truth. Frederick wasn't like the others. He didn't carry the cruelty, the arrogance, or the bitterness many POWs showed. And Frederick, on his side, could not shake the feeling that fate had placed her in his path for a reason. He had seen war at its worst, frozen bodies in Russia, villages reduced to ash, friends torn apart by artillery fire. But inside this American camp, under a burning desert sun, he saw something he had forgotten existed. Gentleness, human warmth, hope. And he saw it in Eleanor.
Still, the danger grew with every passing week. POWs began to whisper. Nurses began to look twice. The tension around them thickened, as if the air itself warned them that something forbidden was rising between two people who were never meant to meet. But love, especially the kind born in impossible conditions, does not disappear because of fear. It hides, waits, strengthens. And soon, Eleanor and Frederick crossed the line from cautious friendship into something deeper, something neither of them dared to name yet, but both felt with overwhelming clarity. The turning point came on a quiet evening when the desert sky glowed orange, fading into a deep violet. Eleanor was finishing her shift, her hands aching from hours of tending to patients, when she stepped outside to breathe the cooler night air. Frederick was returning from the kitchen, carrying empty pans. Their paths met in the middle of a deserted walkway. No guards nearby, no nurses watching. For a moment, the camp felt suspended in time. The two stood facing each other, the wind carrying sand across their boots. Frederick hesitated, as if debating whether to speak. Then he gently set down the pans and whispered, "Are you all right, Miss Powell?" His voice held genuine concern, not duty, not politeness, real, human concern. Something inside Eleanor cracked. The weight of the day, the loneliness of serving a country that questioned her worth, the exhaustion of hiding her feelings, all of it pressed against her at once. She swallowed hard and said, "I'm fine, just tired." But Frederick didn't move. His eyes searched hers with an intensity she had never experienced from anyone in this camp.
That moment, silent, fragile, dangerous, was the moment when both of them realized the truth. This was no longer an accident. This was no longer a harmless connection. This was a bond that neither of them could escape. Frederick stepped a little closer, still respectful, still cautious, and said softly, "If this were a different world, you would never have to feel alone." Those words hit her like a storm. In a camp where orders were strict, boundaries unbreakable, and consequences severe, Frederick had spoken the one thing no one had ever dared to say. She felt her breath shake. She looked away, fighting tears she didn't want him to see. For the first time in her life, someone, not an American officer, not society, not the army, but an enemy soldier, a prisoner, saw her fully as a woman with dreams and wounds and worth. From that night onward, everything changed. They didn't touch, didn't cross any physical line, but the emotional line had been shattered. Every conversation carried a new intensity. Every glance held deeper meaning. Every moment of silence felt electric. And the camp, the guards, the barbed wire, the rules, all of it faded whenever they stood near each other. But the world outside their growing love was preparing to strike back, because in 1944 America, a black nurse and a German prisoner falling in love wasn't just forbidden, it was explosive.
As their bond deepened, Camp Florence began to feel less like a prison and more like a pressure cooker. Rumors started drifting through the barracks. A few POWs noticed the way Frederick's voice softened around Eleanor. A few nurses spotted the rare moments when Eleanor allowed herself a small smile while speaking to him. Whispers grew, dangerous whispers. In a place where everyone lived under surveillance, suspicion spread faster than the desert wind. The American guards didn't need proof. They needed only a reason. And in 1944, a black woman talking to a white man, especially a German POW, was more than enough reason for trouble. Eleanor began to sense the shift. Conversations among the nurses went quiet whenever she entered the room. Some American soldiers stared longer than necessary. A sergeant once stopped her just to ask why she walked near the kitchen more often than usual. She knew exactly what was happening. The camp was closing in on her, waiting for her to slip. Frederick felt the pressure too. One evening, a fellow POW pulled him aside and warned him, "They're watching you." Frederick tried to shrug it off, but his friend grabbed his arm and whispered, "Be careful. They'll punish you, and they'll punish her worse." That thought haunted him. He'd survived the Eastern Front, starvation rations, freezing marches, and artillery shells. But this was a different kind of danger, one he could not shield her from. Still, each time he tried to distance himself, something stronger pulled him back. A shared smile across the courtyard, a brief exchange of words, a glance that said more than either of them dared to speak. They were trapped between desire and survival, both knowing the line was thin. But the heart, once awakened, refuses to retreat. The breaking point came during a violent desert storm. The sky exploded with thunder, and wind ripped across the camp like a living creature. Eleanor was caught outside, struggling to hold her medical bag against the storm. Frederick, running from the kitchen, saw her fighting the wind and sprinted to her without thinking. He grabbed her arm to steady her, shielding her from flying sand. For a brief, electrifying second, his hand wrapped around hers, the first physical contact they had ever shared. It was unplanned, instinctive, and dangerously intimate. A guard stationed near the fence saw it. His flashlight snapped toward them, cutting through the darkness like a gunshot. Frederick released her immediately. Eleanor stepped back. But the damage was done. In a place where a touch could be a crime, that single moment could unravel both of their lives. And yet, as they stood breathless in the storm, something had changed forever. Fate had crossed the line for them. The storm passed, but the consequences did not. The next morning, the camp felt different, tense, sharp, alert. Eleanor's supervisor called her aside and questioned her about her behavior near the kitchen. The tone was icy, controlled, and full of an unspoken warning. She denied everything, keeping her voice calm even as her heartbeat threatened to choke her. Meanwhile, Frederick faced consequences of his own. Guards reassigned him away from the kitchen, placing him in a labor squad digging trenches outside the camp perimeter. The message was clear. They had seen enough to suspect, but not enough to punish, and they wanted to keep it that way. The enforced distance between them was painful. Eleanor walked past empty hallways where she used to see him. Frederick spent long hours under the sun, his hands blistered, his eyes scanning the camp for any glimpse of her. But distance did not break the connection. It only magnified it.
Days later, during her night shift, Eleanor found a folded note tucked behind a crate of medical supplies. No name, no signature, Just a short line in careful handwriting. I am all right. I hope you are too. She knew instantly who had written it. She held the note against her chest, her breath catching. It wasn't a love letter. It wasn't even a sentence that broke rules. But it carried something far more powerful. The confirmation that their connection had survived, even under watch. And for the first time, Eleanor realized the truth she had been avoiding. She was already in love with him. The fear, the danger, the consequences, none of it erased the warmth she felt when she thought of him. Frederick, on the other hand, had reached his own realization. Working in the trenches gave him too much time to think, and he understood with startling clarity that he could leave the camp one day. He could return to Germany. He could rebuild his life. But he did not want to build a future without her in it. One night, exhaustion pushed Eleanor to sit alone behind the medical tent, watching the stars blur above the desert sky. She didn't hear Frederick approach at first. He had found a way to slip past his guards during a water run. When she finally noticed him, her breath froze. He shouldn't have been there. He knew the risk. She knew the risk. But when he whispered her name, Eleanor, everything inside her shattered. He told her, quietly but firmly, that he didn't want this to end with silence. If the war ever ended, if he ever walked free, he would find her. He promised. And for the first time, she didn't hold back. She whispered, "Then come back to me." It was the most forbidden sentence ever spoken inside Camp Florence, a vow that defied nations, rules, race, and war.
As 1945 approached, the world outside Camp Florence began to crumble for Germany. The Allies closed in, cities fell, Hitler's empire disintegrated, and with every radio broadcast, the POWs felt their old lives slipping away. Some became bitter. Some became quiet. Some prayed for defeat just so the war would end. But Frederick carried only one fear, that when the gates opened, he would be forced to walk away from the only person who had ever seen him without judgment. He knew he had no right to ask her to wait. He knew society would tear them apart before they even got a chance to stand together in the world outside. But he also knew that what he felt was not a temporary spark. It was not wartime loneliness. It was something deeper, unshakable, terrifying in its intensity. And Eleanor felt the same. She could not explain it to anyone. Why her heart raced when she heard his footsteps. Why his voice could calm her on the worst days. Why losing him felt more frightening than facing the army's punishment. But the closer the war came to ending, the more the camp tightened its grip. Guards grew stricter. POWs were searched randomly for hidden notes. Nurses were monitored more closely. And then, one morning, an order arrived that changed everything. Frederick's name appeared on a transfer list. He was to be moved to a different camp in the northern desert, away from any familiar face, away from Eleanor. The reason given was labor redistribution, but both of them knew the truth. Someone had noticed too much. Someone had seen the Storm Night incident. Someone had seen the glances. Someone wanted them separated permanently. When Frederick received the news, he felt the ground drop from beneath him. And when Eleanor heard it during a whispered conversation outside the medical tent, she felt as if her chest had been crushed by an invisible weight. Their final moments together inside Camp Florence were brief, painfully, brutally brief. They met near the laundry shed before sunrise, hidden behind stacks of linens. Frederick looked exhausted but determined.
Eleanor looked terrified, not for herself, but for what the world was about to take from her. He reached for her hand, hesitating for only a second before letting his fingers brush hers, a full, deliberate touch they had denied themselves for months. "If I'm sent away," he whispered, "they think they can end this, but they can't." Eleanor tried to speak, but her voice cracked. He brushed a tear from her cheek with the back of his hand, the gentlest touch in the harshest place. "I will find you," he said, "no matter what country I am in, no matter what law says." She nodded, tears falling silently. She couldn't kiss him, couldn't hold him. Not here, not now. But the look they shared in that moment was more binding than any embrace. It was the look of two people who knew they belonged to each other, even if the world refused to allow it. Frederick's transfer happened fast, too fast. Before dawn, trucks rolled into the camp. Guards shouted orders. Chains rattled as POWs were lined up for relocation. Frederick was pushed into the back of a transport truck, surrounded by men who had no idea his entire world was being torn away. Eleanor watched from a distance, hidden behind the medical tent flap, her heart pounding against her ribs. She saw him scanning the crowd, desperate for one last glimpse of her. And when their eyes finally met, just for a second, it felt like time itself halted. No words, no gestures, just two souls locked together through a world determined to separate them. The truck roared to life. The wheels churned up sand. Frederick leaned forward, gripping the metal bars of the truck gate, staring at her until he vanished in a cloud of dust. And then he was gone. Truly gone. The desert suddenly felt colder. The camp felt emptier. Eleanor felt as though a part of herself had been ripped.
In the weeks that followed, Eleanor moved through Camp Florence like a ghost. She worked, tended patients, followed orders, but her spirit dimmed. Nurses noticed she had become quieter. Patients noticed she rarely smiled. And at night, when the desert wind pressed against the camp walls, she sat alone with the memory of Frederick's voice, replaying every conversation, every forbidden moment, every whispered promise. But fate was not finished with their story. On the morning Germany officially surrendered, the camp erupted in noise. Cheers from guards, disbelief from POWs, mixed emotions from everyone. But for Eleanor, the surrender meant something different. It meant prisoners would soon be repatriated. It meant Frederick would be sent back to Germany. And with that realization came a crushing fear. What if she never saw him again? But then, everything changed with a single unexpected moment. One afternoon, while sorting medical supplies, she found another note tucked behind a crate. No signature, just one sentence. "I keep my promise." Her heart froze. The handwriting was unmistakably his. Somehow, impossibly, Frederick had found a way to send her a message from another camp. It was reckless, dangerous, and nearly impossible, but it was proof. Proof that he was fighting to reach her, even when the world was dragging him in the opposite direction. Eleanor folded the note against her heart, feeling something she hadn't felt since the morning he was taken. Hope. Real, burning hope that their story wasn't finished yet. And the world, unknowingly, was about to witness one of the most improbable reunions of the war's aftermath. When the war officially ended, Camp Florence began the slow process of emptying. One by one, prisoners were processed, tagged, and boarded onto trucks, heading either to other U.S. facilities or to ports for repatriation. The air inside the camp shifted, a mixture of relief, confusion, and fear of the unknown. Eleanor tried to hold herself together, but the uncertainty tore at her. She knew Frederick would eventually be shipped back to Germany, a country still in ruins, a place she had never seen and could never safely travel to. Every passing day felt like a countdown, but she clung to his last message. "I keep my promise." It was the only string of hope she had left. Then, one morning, while preparing medical charts, she was abruptly summoned by her supervisor. The tone wasn't cold this time, it was strangely neutral. Eleanor stepped into the administrative hut, her heart pounding. A major looked up from his paperwork and said, "You're being reassigned, Nurse Powell." Her stomach dropped. Had they discovered everything? Was this punishment? But then he handed her a sealed envelope with new deployment papers. She would be transferred, not disciplined. A wave of relief washed through her, followed by confusion. Why now? Why so suddenly? The answer came from one of the other nurses who whispered later, "They're closing parts of the camp. Too many men are being moved out. They need medical staff elsewhere." Eleanor tried to process it. A new assignment meant leaving Camp Florence behind forever. It also meant leaving behind the last place where she had ever seen Frederick Albert. That night, she walked through the quiet paths, looking at the barracks, the kitchen, the medical tent, every corner holding memories she could not speak aloud. She stopped near the laundry shed, the place where they had whispered their last promise. For the first time since he was taken, she allowed herself to cry openly. The desert wind carried her sobs away, and with them the last piece of her fear. Because deep inside, she believed something she hadn't dared admit before. If fate had brought them together in a prison camp in the middle of the Arizona desert, then fate was not done with them. A week later, she boarded a military transport bus, heading toward her next station. As the camp disappeared behind her, she pressed her hand against the window, whispering, "Come back to me." The bus drove off, kicking up dust as the sun rose over the desert horizon. She didn't know where Frederick was now. She didn't know if he had been shipped back to Germany, or if he was still somewhere in the United States. All she knew was that their time in Camp Florence was over, and the next chapter of their story would begin in a world no longer at war, but still divided in ways that made their love feel impossible. Yet destiny, once awakened, refuses to stay silent. Frederick Albert was eventually released months after the war ended. He stepped onto German soil to find a homeland shattered, buildings reduced to rubble, streets filled with hunger, a future uncertain for every returning soldier. But the moment he was free, one thought consumed him: Eleanor. He knew the chances of seeing her again were nearly impossible. He was a former enemy soldier. She was an African-American woman in a segregated United States. Their love was not only forbidden, it was illegal in many states. Yet he held on to her final words, etched into his memory. "Then come back to me." And so he made the most daring decision of his life. He applied to immigrate back to America. The process was brutal. Former German POWs were met with suspicion. Immigration approvals were rare. But Frederick had one powerful factor working in his favor. The child Eleanor was carrying, conceived in the final weeks before his transfer. When the paperwork revealed this truth, the American authorities reluctantly allowed him to return. And so, in 1947, Frederick Albert arrived in New York, not as a prisoner, not as a soldier, but as a man determined to fulfill a promise across continents. Eleanor, meanwhile, had moved on with her life, building a career, raising her son, all while keeping her past locked inside her heart. She had no idea Frederick was coming back. She expected nothing. She hoped for everything. And then, one evening, as she stepped outside her building in upstate New York, she froze. Because standing at the bottom of the stairs, thinner than she remembered, exhausted from travel, but unmistakably him, was Frederick. He held his hat in his hands, his eyes trembling with the weight of years and oceans crossed. "Eleanor," he said softly, "I kept my promise."
What followed was not dramatic like Hollywood, not fireworks or slow-motion embraces. It was something purer, something human. She walked slowly toward him, tears streaming down her cheeks. He reached for her hand the same way he had behind the laundry shed years earlier. And in that moment, the barbed wire, the guards, the war, the segregation, all of it vanished. They married soon after, building a life in a country where many still disapproved of their union. But they didn't care. They had survived war, separation, racism, and borders. Nothing else could break them. Their love story, born in a desert prison camp, fought for across nations, became one of the most unlikely and powerful romances of World War II. A reminder that even in humanity's darkest hours, light finds a way, that love can grow between enemies, that two hearts meant for each other cannot be stopped by fences, flags, or fear, and that a promise whispered in the shadows of a storm can echo across years until the day it is finally fulfilled.